I'm Julie Hanson. I'm a lecturer of nursing. I teach NUR 231, drug therapy, in a second year undergraduate course, and it's a fairly large class of about 260 students. I started to flip the classroom about 2 years ago, and the reason why I was interested in that was because I looked back at some of the CTAC or the student feedback for this course over the last few years, well, basically back to 2005. And when I looked at the feedback, students had always had problems understanding the fundamental scientific concepts within drug therapy. And when I used to do lectures, I used to go into the lecture theatre, and I found I was just looking at this sea of blank faces. And I felt that I couldn't gauge what they were understanding. And then what happened was this would transfer into the tutorials. And I'd find that I'd be doing mini lectures in the tutorials because people just hadn't grasped the fundamental concepts in the lecture. So I thought, what can I do about this? How can I get people to grasp these concepts earlier on in the course? Because these concepts are foundational to understanding aspects of the course later on. I also realised that there was a strategic plan in place at USC, and that was to implement blended learning into our teaching and learning strategies. And I was aware that blended learning meant that you're trying to engage students before they come to the classroom, then whilst they're in the classroom in a face-to-face context, and then extend the learning outside of the classroom. And I thought, well, this is interesting, and I realised that flipping the classroom could achieve this. So what I decided to do was I decided to do some narrated PowerPoints. And the first thing I did was to set about doing a voiceover of my lectures. And I called them e-lectures. And they were about 10 to 20 minutes long. And I basically just put down all the fundamental scientific concepts in the e-lecture. And then I made them available to students so that they could watch them before they came to the lecture. Then what I had to do was I had to change the actual lecture content. So I decided that rather than put up just a series of PowerPoint slides, I actually included a quiz into the lecture. So I would test the students on the content that they looked at in the e-lecture. And what I found was that students would become quite empowered by this, because when they could answer the question, they'd get really delighted and say, wow, I knew that, now I know that. And I found that to be, that was quite inspiring for me also. I designed a quiz that asked them questions about the e-lecture content. I asked them to answer those questions individually, first of all, and then I'd ask them to share their paper with the person next to them. And that meant that they could start a conversation about perhaps what they hadn't seen or what they had misunderstood. And there was a little bit of peer sharing to start with. And then after that, then we would share the answers and I would give them feedback and clarify anything that they didn't understand. So once we had the quiz done, then I'd move to the lecture slides. But within the lecture slides now, I actually had a case study. So what I'd be doing with the case study is then showing students or demonstrating to students how those fundamental concepts now apply and relate to the real world in clinical practice. And so the case studies were absolutely vital then to them understanding, why am I telling you this in the first place? Because it has to have some clinical application. So once we'd done that, I also then set up a wiki page in the Blackboard. And the idea of the wiki page was a share your ideas wiki. It was for students. And the idea was that if a student asked me a question during the lecture and it was something that I hadn't intended to cover, and it might take us off track and we might deviate and obviously not cover the amount of content that I wanted to, then they could pose this question into the wiki. And it extended the learning beyond the classroom, which is what I'd hoped to achieve in the first place. So the way in which that it has changed the lecture is that it's become much more dialogic, and I find that I'm actually much more engaged myself. And so I find that there's a lot more conversation occurring in those lectures now, and it has actually transformed more into a workshop, I find. And students are happy to discuss things which before, I think, because of the nature of the course and the fact that there were these very difficult scientific concepts, they were often fearful of speaking out and saying that they didn't understand something. So I actually find that it has helped in terms of the kind of dialogic aspect within the lecture. The knock-on effect is actually in the tutorials as well. Now I find that I'm not spending time in tutorials doing like mini lectures. We can actually move on to other content, and we can actually do more with case studies and look at the element of critical thinking and clinical reasoning in our tutorials, which is the application of those principles. I see the flipped classroom as an element of blended learning in that you have to engage students before, during and after the classroom. So one of the things that I do now in tutorials is I give students a worksheet and I ask them to do some pre-reading again, so similar to the e-lecture in that there's an element of ownership for the students. They have to do some preparatory reading before they come to the classroom. And they have to write down what they think they've learned from their readings, and then also what needs clarification, so that the classroom again is much more interactive. I find that in the classroom now I can do more participatory activities. I get students to create posters, we do role play, and I find that getting the students up onto their feet and doing things is actually a good way of getting them to communicate with one another, and there's an element of peer learning that goes on within the classroom as well now, which is a follow-on from their lectures. So all in all, students get the impression that they're there to take ownership of their learning, and it's not just me just talking to them and feeding them information. In considering what issues I've encountered, one of the main problems, I suppose, is non-attendance. Now that materials are available extensively before the class and that there are e-lectures and there are worksheets, some students, because of their time restrictions and their family commitments, tend not to turn up to class. And the way that I find to overcome this is to make class much more inviting. And the way that I do that is that in the worksheets and the preparatory reading, I actually explain to them what they're going to learn in that class and how it'll be useful to them in an assessment. So, for example, I might say, you've listened to this particular concept in the e-lecture. We're going to apply this in the classroom, and it's going to help you with your assessment, such as assessment number 4 or assessment number 10. And this gives students the impetus to actually turn up to class, because they need to deepen their knowledge of that particular concept in order to be able to answer the questions in the assessment. It's been a very interesting experience, because students do tell me that they actually listen to my e-lectures while they're making dinner. So they're making spaghetti bolognese while they're listening to my e-lectures, or that they've recorded them and they play them in the car where they're taking their children to school, and they say, "Mom, she sounds like Monty Python." But it's actually generating a lot more sort of casual listening, which is quite interesting. In terms of how I monitored the impact that this was having, I actually did a very small project within the course last year, which is going to be a bigger project this year. And I actually put up a survey, and I asked students what impact the e-lectures were having on their learning. And I found 3 themes that had come out of it. And the first was that it had impacted on their thinking, their engagement and their confidence. So I had feedback that said definitely has improved their understanding of those scientific concepts. It's cemented their understanding. In terms of engagement, they really liked the idea that there were quizzes and that they were able to ask one another questions, they were able to ask me questions, and they felt that they could get involved in the discussion in the lecture without feeling under pressure. And then in terms of confidence, they said the fact that they could get those questions right, and I would validate that and say, absolutely, you got that right, they felt that really increased their confidence. So that's going to be part of a bigger project this year, where I'm going to survey students before we go into the lecture to say, what are you expecting of this course? What are you expecting to learn? How do you expect to learn that? And then follow it through with another survey that says, what did you get out of the course? And it'll just be a much more comprehensive inquiry about the use of e-lectures in the flipped classroom. The theoretical framework that I applied to this was problem-based learning, and that's because in problem-based learning you're actually drawing on a person's previous experience, and then you're deconstructing what they know and reconstructing new knowledge together in the classroom around a particular issue or problem. And so that works as a good framework for this particular approach to teaching. I'm passionate about flipping the classroom because I actually enjoy it more. I find when I'm in a dialogue with the students, I just find it much more interesting and much more inspiring. But the one thing I would advise any academic who's thinking of flipping the classroom is to let go of content. If you're trying to do 20 or more lecture slides with content, you won't be able to get through that. What you need to do is pick one or two of the really important major threshold concepts within your course, deliver those one or two, and get feedback from your audience, from your students, to find out if they've really understood that and understood that concept. If you let go of content, what it means is you can demonstrate how to analyse that concept and how to apply it to clinical practice. And if you can do it once, you can replicate that. So it's a transferable skill. So rather than loading up with lots and lots of content, pick the one or two threshold concepts and go to them quite deeply.